Okay, well, thanks very much. I'm in that unenviable spot right after our big feast, so hopefully there's some attention we can muster here today. I don't think I need to introduce myself. I'm Martin Carver. I live in Nelson. I'm a consulting hydrologist and geomorphologist. I also am the chair of the Friends of Kootenay Lake, and I'm involved quite heavily in the Columbia River Treaty and some other things locally. I'm absolutely delighted to have the opportunity to come and talk about the Columbia Basin, the Upper Columbia Basin. It's one of my very favorite subjects in my life, and when it also involves water monitoring, water resources, climate change, the excitement lifts higher for me. So thanks very much for your attention and the opportunity to have this conversation. I'm here presenting a project of the CBT. This is work that the CBT has funded and has been spearheading actually for some time. And so this is a CBT presentation, and this the report from which this presentation comes is fully available, freely available online. You can go to their website. It's very easy to find if you Google any of those keywords on the website. But I'm also here because hydrologic stationarity is dead. By that, what I mean is the whole phenomenon of looking back at past years' hydrology and using it as a measure, as a reliable measure of the future, is something that is now dead. We're in a different time. Things are changing quite quickly, and because of that, that has spawned the interest in looking at water monitoring and climate change in the Upper Columbia Basin. A lot of people contributed to this project, and I'll have an acknowledgement slide at the end, and I'll talk about that then. And Tim Hicks at CBT has been a champion of this project too. I just want to mention that. So presentation overview, there's 3 parts. First of all, we'll step back a bit and ask ourselves, what are the water resources in the basin? How are they formed? How are they shaped? What are the pressures on them? That's about half the presentation. And then once we've got that learning under our belt and on that common ground, we can ask ourselves about the status and trends of water resources in the basin and go through all the components as we can in a short period and start looking at gaps and opportunities for addressing the gaps. And finally, this can lead to monitoring and data opportunities going forward. Okay, the report and this presentation are guided by these 3 questions. And I just want to read them out so that we're all on the same page. The first one is, what is the current state of basin water monitoring and the associated scientific understanding of the state of basin water resources? So it's essentially, what is there? What do we have? And the second one is, what are the expected effects of the projected climate change on basin water resources? So how are things changing with climate change? And the third, what opportunities exist to improve our understanding of basin water resources in the future? What are our opportunities to address gaps and really shape the world we're living in? So let's step back then and start just looking into our water resources. I think we all know a lot about them, but I guess what I want to do is lay out a bit of a story, a scientific story. This is a whole bunch of science about to come at you, and I want to lay down some building blocks for at the end start to look at the system that we live in, to use scientific jargon, the system that we live in, and how we can judiciously look at the gaps and opportunities there for being successful in the coming years with climate change. So this graphic portrays the suite of water resources, and of course we're familiar with the sort of surface features that we think of a lot, like the lakes and the reservoirs and the rivers, but there's also wetlands, there's also the groundwater, and let's not forget the inputs to a lot of this, which is the precipitation, the accumulating snowpack, and then the glaciers. So when I say water resources, I mean all of that. It's a big encompassing term. Now the Upper Columbia Basin, which is the subject of the presentation, is that part of the Columbia Basin that drains into the Columbia River in Canada. So it excludes the Okanagan and the Boundary, which drains into the Columbia River in the States. I'll just be calling that the basin. And often an entry point to looking at a piece of land from a water perspective is to ask, what watershed are we in? And I just want to start there for a moment. I think most of us are familiar with the rather quirky nature of the basin, how it has these two very large rivers flowing up and down around the basin, and then there's a collection of much smaller watersheds that drain into the Kootenay or the Columbia rivers. So we have the Elk on the east side and the Slocan on the west side, which are the largest two, and then we have a collection of smaller and smaller ones, including many that are small that drain directly into the Columbia or Kootenay River. So, you know, if you are lucky enough to live in the basin, then you can locate yourself on this map. And it's a great entry point for thinking about water in the basin. But it's not enough. And I want to go a little farther on that theme. So we have, needless to say, a wealth of water in the basin, in the Upper Columbia Basin. I think that's well known to all of us. Although we only have 8% of what's now called British Columbia of its land area, we have a disproportionate importance internationally, nationally, provincially, and of course locally. We have 1,787 glaciers covering 1,600 square kilometers. We have 2/3 of our precipitation falls as snow, so it often leads to being called a snow forest. We have the province's 3rd largest natural lake, namely Kootenay Lake. We generate about half of the power, electrical power in the province. That's an average, and perhaps for me, one of the most startling statistics is that if you look at the flow of the Columbia where it drains into the Pacific Ocean, although it only has 15% of the area of that watershed at its mouth, the basin contributes 40% of the runoff. So it has this very high value internationally in the larger system. So we can't forget the value of the basin with respect to water resources. It's very high. So how did it come to be? Well, when you start looking at hydrology, you have to start by looking at climate, because patterns in climate show up as patterns in hydrology. So let's just talk about climate for a minute. What are some of the main climate factors that shape hydrology? Well, we can identify 3 to start with. There's the very large continental scale factors such as continental climate to the east, maritime or Pacific influences to the west, and then minor boreal influences in the northern part of the basin. Those all collide and interact, and I think we're familiar, right, with the East Kootenay being drier, colder in the winter, the West Kootenay being wetter, and the northern area wetter. There's also north-south trending mountain ranges, which create orographic lift, create tremendous influence on precipitation that creates shadows. These are also interacting with those continental scale issues. Now, as well as natural variability, I just want to spend a moment talking about climate modes, because we're going to be talking about climate change in a minute, and climate modes are often brought up with the question of, oh, maybe it's just a cycle in the climate that we're seeing. Well, there are a variety of climate modes that do act on the basin. The 2 most well-known would be ENSO, the El Nino Southern Oscillation, and the PDO, the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, and respectively they deal with the kind of the organization of surface water temperatures in the southern Pacific and the northern Pacific. Actually, ENSO is the only one really well statistically correlated to climate in the basin, but they're actually related. PDO actually flows out of ENSO, so ENSO is the real anchor on that. I don't want to spend much more time on the climate modes except to point them out and to say that they're real. There's a warm and a cool phase on them, and they don't change the phenomenon of warming and its effects on climate. They just make it more complicated to do the analysis, because you have embedded cycles. But, warming is continuing all the same. So these are some influences on climate, and of course climate influences hydrology. The climate and the diversity that we just talked about that a moment ago, that leads to tremendous ecological diversity, from drier pine types in the east to Engelmann spruce subalpine fir, ICH, the interior cedar hemlock forests. We even have coastal ecosystems in the mica. We have tremendous diversity that flow out of the differences in climate and precipitation. Now, you might be surprised to learn what a small difference in mean annual temperature, So that's the average temperature through the year. What a small amount of change in that can lead to a tremendous change in ecosystems. So this slide is trying to portray that. Look, the top part is about temperature. And if you look at the mean annual temperature for Golden, it's 4.6 degrees. And the mean annual temperature for Castlegar is 8.3. So just 3.7 degrees separates those tremendously different places. And you can see Vancouver is 10.6, so it's 6 degrees different from Golden. So just keep in mind that 3.7, or the range of a few degrees, because we're going to be looking at some changes in temperature in a moment. And I just want to acknowledge that, of course, precipitation is different in these ecosystems, and that's, you know, has an important role to play. Okay, so remember what I said, patterns in the climate show up as patterns in hydrology. And so we have a very heterogeneous place that we call the Upper Columbia Basin. And so how do we rationally and systematically approach looking at what we know about the place, how it's changing, and perhaps what we might want to do to learn more about it, if we want to throw some of our effort and resources at it. So the gold standard in my book is to come up with hydroclimatic regions. So break your area down into reasonably homogeneous areas hydrologically, so that you can start looking at them independently. So this has been done. This work was led by Greg Utzig. I worked closely with him on this, and we've now got a set of 10, I'm just going to call them hydrologic regions for the basin. And these are defined as groups of watersheds with consistent elevational sequences of climate and similar patterns of runoff. So it's a kind of a combination of the climate and the runoff. And I just want to draw your attention to these 5. These 5 are going to show up in the next few plots, and I've chosen these 5 because they essentially bracket the range of climates and conditions that we have in the basin, more or less, for most of the land. So you can, if you do live in the basin, you can identify where you are, and you can follow along on the plots if you like. But we're in the Upper Kootenay right now. Just a moment. So what we're going to do now is shift gears a little bit, and we're going to start talking about the pressures on water resources. And now, traditionally, we have often thought about pressures as being land use pressures. That's kind of the way it was when I went to university. But since then, of course, a new human pressure called climate change has entered and become a very, very important pressure. So we actually now have to think of climate change, and then all the other land use practices become the sort of big set of pressures. So I'd like to address both of those. But I'd like to talk about the climate change, or some people say climate disruption, first. So here we are, there's a series of plots that are in the same format. So I'll just take a moment to explain the first one. The 5 colors are the 5 hydrologic regions, which I highlighted on the map prior. And you'll see the y-axis is something we're going to talk about, and here it's mean annual temperature, and the x-axis is time through the 20th and 21st century. And on the plot you see a series of dots. The dots on the left are connected by a line, the dots on the right are floating in space. The ones on the left are connected by a line because that's history that's actually happened, and so there's a continuous plot there. The ones on the right are projections using global climate models, and so they're in sort of decadal chunks. Now, this isn't a presentation where we're going to spend half an hour talking about variability and modeling and get lost in that. We want to hone in on the main message. So these plots have been simplified to transmit the main message. And one way they've been simplified is that we have taken a specific emissions scenario and used that, rather than talking about all the different models and all the different emission scenarios in the climate change projections. And so what we've taken is an average of business as usual and a fairly ambitious plan of reduction. And it happens to be roughly equivalent to the Paris Climate Agreement, very similar to that. So what you see of the dots on the right are actually what the global community has agreed to. We've not even met that, but we have at least agreed to that. And so just keep that in mind, that these are actually quite realistic for being what is in store for us in the future. So I'm just going to go through these 4 plots now. And quite readily you can see that through the 20th century, which is the part on the left, temperature has crept up. And it's crept up in all the regions, and it's gone up something in the order of a degree, something like that. In the 21st century, you can see that the rate of increase of temperature is faster. And overall, there's something in the order of a few degrees that we have in store for us, starting in the baseline of, which is just at the end of the last century. Remember what I was saying about 3.7 degrees separating Golden and Castlegar, and the change here is more than that. So now if we, that was summer. Now if we move to mean winter temperatures, we see at least similar pattern. We see a stronger rise. Winter temperatures have come up more than the summer temperatures, but they're going up similarly in the coming years. That's the projection. And it's worth noting for winter that now we're getting close to that magic freezing point. So there's going to be more and more incidences of precipitation falling as rain. There's going to be more incidences of melt, midwinter thaws. And so that's quite significant. If we stay with winter, but now turn and look at precipitation, of course the pattern's different from the last century. It's done what it's done. It's gone up and down. And then the projection going forward is for modest increases in precipitation in the winter. So warmer and wetter winters, what those last two slides show us. And we had hotter summers. What about the precipitation in the summer? That's what this slide shows. And so it's done what it's done in the past. It's gone down and up. But the projections are, and this is not controversial at all, the projections are for the summer precipitation to go down. Every global climate model that is offered by PCIC, Pacific Climate Impacts Consortium, has that same outcome, a decline in summer precipitation. No disagreement. So we're having hotter and drier summers, and hotter and drier equates to drought and fire, right? So just to put that out there as one of the central pressures that's on our water resources. Now there's two other plots coming up where we'll stay with climate change, and these plots put the hydrologic region at the bottom of the slide now as bar plots, and the time periods are now the different bars. So the black one is the baseline, 61 to 90, and then the projecteds go out from there. Now what the plot is showing though is the proportion of winter precipitation that falls as snow. I mean, traditionally we think of we're in winter and then the snow starts coming. We're in spring and it starts raining. Well, that's projected to change quite significantly. There's two slides here. The first slide focuses on the major valley bottoms, basically where we live. And that's why they've been structured this way. And at the bottom, oh, you can't quite see that, but at the bottom, oh, up there, no. It's the, doesn't matter, it doesn't matter. The elevation is slightly different depending on the valley bottom, on the hydrologic region. But the main message here, and this is for the Upper Kootenay hydrologic region, is whereas the valley bottoms might have had in the 61 to 90 period, 80% of the winter precipitation fell as snow. As we move through this century, it's projected to drop below half to 40 or 39%. And of course, it doesn't stop there, right? Like the world doesn't just steady out at the end of the century. Things continue depending on our emissions and depending on lags in the climate system. So you can see that in the valley bottoms, we're going to have a very much a rain-dominated life by the end of the century. Now, if you then look up into the source areas of the watersheds, and the way I define that is the upper 60% of the area, the highest 60%, that's this plot, so it says above the H60. And you see, of course, the amount of winter, the proportion of winter precipitation is much higher that falls as snow. But of course, there's the same trend that it's dropping. So it's going to go from something like 95 last century to 75. That means through the winter, in our source areas where we rely on snow accumulating, which provides storage, it stores our water until we need it in the summer and fall, a quarter of that by the end of the century is projected to fall as rain. And presumably, much of that, so some will get trapped, won't be stored as long. Now, these pressures on water resources, remember pressures. We've got the climate change and we've got the conventional land use practices. Well, we're looking at climate change. I'm just touching on some of the changes, and I'm trying to present it in terms of common sense ways of seeing it, these hydrologic regions. But there's mean annual temperature changes, there's precipitation changes, but there's also the very, very important extreme climate changes. There's a lot of science coming out on this these days, and one of the guidelines now is that with every degree in increase in mean annual temperature, you get a 15% increase in the extreme climate, the precipitation, say. So that's a very important piece of this, and I'm not going to address that at all. The extremes are increasing as the means change. So let's just shift gears now and go to that other side of the human pressures equation and look at land use practices. And this I'd like to divide into two, because we have so many dams, as Marty introduced this morning. You named 25, I had counted 19, but it's in that zone. We have so many dams on the Columbia and Kootenay that it's worth a special note. And so you can look at this work from a variety of perspectives, and this is all summarized from Utzit and Schmidt 2011, which is often called the Dam Impact Study. And this is some of the larger reservoirs associated with the dams, because although we say dams, it's often the reservoirs where the impacts are being felt. And it just shows the distribution of the ecosystem types that are affected. So you have, you know, the Arrow Reservoir disproportionately affected lakes, because multiple major lakes were inundated. And then if you go over to the Duncan, it's more well distributed, or the Koocanusa. So you can also divide that up by like the total area of the dams in the pie, and you can see which ones are occupying the greater area of this land, and it's about the size of Yoho National Park, if you add it all up. This is a very significant impact. And you can also do the distribution by ecosystem type, from floodplains, river streams, wetlands, uplands, and lakes. We often get normalized to these, this is just the way it is, but this isn't the way it was. Certainly wasn't the way it was when the Tunaka were living here without us, the visitors. So back to this cartoon then, where we have the water resources. Now we see on this the land use activities. Of course, this isn't a typical Kootenay scene, because it's a bit more distributed than that. But you can see all like a concentrated version of our human activities overlain on the mountains and the water resources. It gets interesting when you start to add up both the climate disruption part and the land use part. So CBT has developed these icons, which I'd encourage people to use them if they're useful in your work. I think they're wide open, and they communicate the different kinds of changes that are happening with climate change. So you can see on the right column, decrease in summer precipitation, which we talked about, an increase in the winter precip, etc. So it chunks it down, the kinds of things that we need to get ready for. Now, if you take these sorts of changes with climate change and add them to what's happening with our more conventional day-to-day land use practices, we get quite the outcome, because we're getting two sets of impacts superimposed, and we're getting interactions between them. And this is where it gets really interesting. So for instance, whereas before you may have been able to, I'm just throwing this out, contaminate a stream to a certain degree because there was enough dilution. Now with the low flows being lower, you might not be able to sustain that level of impact. Or an activity on a slope that was stable before might not be stable anymore, because there might be more rain, the extremes are higher. So the same activity is causing a landslide where it didn't before. And these sorts of things mean many, many things need rethinking. Now this looks a little alarming, and I mean it is in some ways, but of course this is a concentrated graphic to try and communicate a whole bunch of different things where you see water levels dropping, habitat loss, water temperature increasing. It would be distributed over the landscape. So what this brings up, though, is what do we need to do to learn about our water resources? What are we not studying? What are we not monitoring? because there's a lot of change that's underway. And that's really the content of the second half of the talk, is looking at the status and trends this is why these words water monitoring are put together with climate change. Like what do we know about our water resources scientifically? What are we recording? What are we monitoring? What are we maybe missing? And it's very much based in the adage that I think we've all heard is you can't manage what you don't measure. It's a very Western scientific principle, and it does guide the sorts of comments that you're going to hear in the next few minutes. So there's data and there's science. The data would be sort of the monitoring aspect of it, the mapping, what have you, and the science is the work that we've done to make some sense of what we have in the way of data. So I'm going to walk through just the different components of the water resources, but before we do that, I just want to step back for a second and look at general trends this is within the basin of monitoring progress. And these are 4 different groupings of monitoring. You can see them in the legend at the top: hydrometric, snow, climate and water quality. It's not entirely encompassing, but it's pretty good. It's actually quite a hard graphic to put together. And we see a tremendous rise in the effort that's been put out to monitor the water resources through the 20th century, and then it generally peaked around the late 80s, early 90s. Those of us who were around that time will remember that. And then they dropped, and they're either dropping or stabilizing depending on a bunch of things. So that's sort of where we are. And I guess the good news out of this is it certainly highlights that there's many opportunities to fill gaps. So we can step up for that. So now we're going to turn to water quantity and emit and water quality, and then community-based monitoring. Those are the 3 areas of inquiry. So why would we monitor water quantity? Well, I think it's clear we want to know what kind of water supplies we have for whatever drinking or any other services. We want to know what the rivers and watersheds need. Those are environmental flow needs. We might want to get benefit from them, like work like hydropower and irrigation, etc. Right? There's a lot of reasons to monitor water quantity, and traditionally we have done a fair bit of monitoring. But now we even have a new reason, that's to understand the effects of climate change, to support our adaptation. It's changing sufficiently quickly that we actually need to monitor more concertedly. Who monitors water quantity? Well, a lot of the monitoring is done by the major agencies with the federal and the provincial governments. But then you also have a bit of industry. You see BC Hydro and Fortis in there. There is some university work in the Columbia Basin Snow and Glacier Research Network as well, GSC, and community-based monitoring, which I'll talk about at the end. But, so there's a lot of players going on in water quantity. And here's the map. It's in the report, so it's online. And what this map is, it breaks it down into 2. Because there's a lot to show on one map. So this is more the inputs. This is the climate, the snow, the glaciers, that side of the equation. And just wanted to highlight a couple things. There's 5 glacier sites. So there's 5 places where there is a program of looking at glacial change within the basin. There's 56 Environment Canada and Climate Change or BC Hydro long-term climate stations, 56. And there's 48 BC snow survey stations within the basin. And then there's MOTI and FLNRO. The key, though, in this is that, well, okay, there's a fair bit going on, but the key is that they're not evenly distributed by hydrologic region or by elevation. Like, they are where they are, and there is some sense to where they are, of course, but it isn't necessarily meeting the needs of the whole area and understanding the variability and as it's subject to the variety of pressures that we talked about a moment ago. And you can see the Nordic Glacier here on the left in the 80s, and then 30 years later, just a couple years ago, pulled right back there and there. Okay, some notable trends that we see in the water quantity data. There has been a decline in the snowpack. Corrected for PDO, it's 5 to 6% in the last part of the last century. It hasn't been analyzed since then. Snowpack is disappearing sooner, and there's less snow at low elevations. I think we recognize that. There's also been a full quarter of the glacial area has been lost in 30 years, from 1985 to present. A full quarter has been lost, with a projection in the published science of complete loss by 2100. You know, that's a modeled projection. But, and there's also some science that's suggesting that we're approaching peak glacial melt. So just a moment on that. Peak glacial melt is as the temperatures warm and glaciers start to melt, there's actually more runoff for a while because they're melting. And then once the mass of the glacier has melted back sufficiently, then the runoff starts to decline. And that point where it reaches its peak is the peak glacial melt. And depending where you are in the basin, some areas, like in the very south, probably have already passed that. Some areas may be approaching it. And this is something that would be very good to know, because as Marty was saying before, we depend on our glaciers in some of our basins, and it'd be nice to know when we're going to be running out of the runoff from them. So monitoring gaps and opportunities. You can see the installation of high elevation climate stations at the top, because most of our climate stations are actually at lower elevation, and we don't need them there as much as we do need them at the high elevation. And analyzing changes that are happening. The data that we have isn't sufficiently analyzed. We could do much more work on glaciers. I think it's quite expensive and time consuming, so it's good we have the work that we're doing, but we could do more. And as I was mentioning about peak glacial melt, it would be good to do some more analysis of the hydrometric records in relation to glaciers to determine what the progress of that is. Now, the other side of water quantity is the streams and groundwater, like the surface water and groundwater. And there's the map there, and the map is emphasizing there's 45 stations that are remaining Water Survey of Canada stations. So those are Environment Canada, Climate Change, hydrometric stations. Many were closed in the 90s, and there's 45 there. Reservoirs are monitored by industry. Lakes, except for Kootenay Lake, none are monitored for level. And groundwater, we have a total of 5 OBS wells in the whole region, so it's pretty sparse. Some trends in streams and groundwater. Well, there appears to be earlier dates of the freshet and an increase in size and frequency of peak flows, but that's not been analyzed scientifically. That's more an anecdotal experience, and leading to lower low flows in the summer and late summer. And this is just theoretically, in the future there could be decreased availability of locally sourced groundwater, depending on how humans respond to changing water sources. Monitoring gaps and opportunities then. There's an interesting discrepancy between modeled projections of what the river should be doing in light of the evolving climate and what the hydrometric records say. So this warrants a bit more work, because it suggests that there's quite some complexities going on, maybe involving the jet stream and air masses coming from the Pacific, because remember, we don't have a lot of monitoring going at high elevation, so we don't actually know what's going on up there, and we make assumptions in our models. So that whole world could do with some more science. Smaller watersheds and watersheds at mid and high elevations are sparsely monitored, so we know very little about them. Stream flow in the northern basin is sparsely monitored as well. That needs some attention, and collecting groundwater data and conducting groundwater vulnerability analysis is also a big gap. Moving on to water quality. Why do we monitor water quality? You could lump it into 2 great reasons, proactive and reactive. Proactive reasons, we want to know the health of a water body, and we want to know what we can do with it safely for the water body's health and for our own. So knowing about it, that would be proactive. And then reactive, compliance issues, when somebody or something is doing something to a water body and there's a consequence, or just looking at the effects of an activity. But of course, here again, we now have another reason, and that's to understand the effects of climate disruption so that we can adapt. Who monitors water quality? Well, a lot of the same cast of characters as the groups who monitor water quantity. However, you'll see now Interior Health Authority has popped up, and the BC Fish and Wildlife Compensation Program are on there. Here's the map, and there's quite a lot going on, but I have to just acknowledge that a lot of those sites are discontinued. So some of those points are historic points. There are 38 streams actively being monitored by the feds and province. There's 27 lakes and reservoirs that have monitoring, and there's 3 groundwater wells that have water quality monitoring, 3. And remember, this excludes, everything I've said so far excludes community-based monitoring, because I'm going to talk about it on its own in a minute. So some trends in water quality. Well, we know that there's been the loss of the valley bottom wetlands and riparian ecosystems for hydropower and flood control, especially around the Columbia River treaty dams. We have an ongoing loss and deterioration of foreshores due to shoreline development in some of our more popular lakes, and there's been issues in Lake Windermere that are ongoing and being addressed, and there's been issues on Kootenay Lake and other areas. So that's an area of pressure, and nutrient depletion in reservoirs associated with the dams. I think high water temperatures are expected, and some people anecdotally do report this. Jerry's not here, but an increased water quality concerns would be expected with a decline in water flow and an increase in, let's say, sedimentation, etc. So some monitoring gaps and opportunities then. Wetlands are essentially unmonitored for water quality. There is some initiatives here and there, but they're community-based monitoring. Local groundwater quality near sewage and waste facilities is less monitored. And we could use an increase in monitoring scope of our small and medium lakes. They're poorly monitored. And water quality objectives for lakes could be developed, and in fact in more of an integrated report card. That's often in different silos, and we could bring together the information we have to sort of a report card level. Lastly then, community-based initiatives, community-based monitoring, citizen science, this is related, it's sometimes called that, and we have people in the room who have lots of experience with this in particular. There's lots of initiatives underway in the basin. The Columbia Basin Water Quality Monitoring Project, which we have heard talk about today, uses the Cabin Protocol, and that's been ongoing for some time. There are lake stewardship efforts, Jim Smith Lake and others. Living Lakes Canada has created a groundwater monitoring program, and that's actually expanding. North Kootenay Lake Water Monitoring Program is monitoring a lot of water quantity in smaller catchments to understand climate change impacts. And the sponsor organization for today, the Columbia Basin Watershed Network, provides a variety of support for community-based monitoring groups. Okay, did I show the map? Did I breeze over the map? Yeah, there's the map. I didn't really point that out, but the monitoring sites are where they are. Usually they're driven by the interest in a local community, by a local community. That usually, it's not usually driven by a kind of a regional assessment. It's passion and interest from local people, and that's what it turns out to be. So, finishing then, monitoring data priorities and opportunities sort of divided into 2 grand areas. The first is just what you could refer to as the backbone monitoring network, which is inevitably going to be those organizations with very big pockets, the agencies and perhaps industry. And some of the site priorities would be, like I mentioned, northern areas, high elevation areas, and smaller systems. Component priorities, wetlands, glaciers, and groundwater. Not saying the other areas aren't important too, but these ones are particularly have particularly large gaps. And then collaboration opportunities, sub-regional gaps, and local monitoring needs. We could look to meeting those needs as we fill in the backbone. So we essentially feed 2 or 3 birds with 1 seed, with the same monitoring effort. But then there's a lot more like program management and collaboration issues. There's developing the capacity for community-based monitoring. This could be something we do more of. We could increase collaboration among water monitoring entities. These I'm thinking in terms of the backbone agencies. We could improve public accessibility of water monitoring data, because it's actually difficult to get your hands on some of these data. Some are very easy, like the Water Survey of Canada, others not so easy. And then integrating the data to assemble like a big picture understanding along the lines of what this report's trying to do, but much more thorough, much more detailed. These would be some opportunities going forward. Now, I know that was a lot of science. Like, that was a lot in a short amount of time. And in fact, there's some pretty alarming messages embedded in the storyline, because our world is changing quickly. And so I just wanted to reflect on that with some actual anecdotal data to to drive the point home a bit. And so most of these slides are courtesy of Mel Reisner, who is a climate scientist based near Nelson, who works for CPT on contract quite a bit, communicating climate change. And so this trace here you see of rain and snow is from a long-term climate tape station that we have in Caslow. It dates back over 100 years. And it shows that overall precipitation is increasing, as we expect with our models and our experience, but the amount of rain versus snow is turning to rain. So start there. This is Caslow. That's September to March precipitation. Now I want to run through three experiences that the Caslow area had recently. The first one dates to 2012, and this plot is showing the total June precipitation dating back at that Caslow climate station. And you can see that up until the early 2000s, we had a certain stationarity that is sort of evident in the data. We get extremes, but they're in a band, if you like. And then some 10, 15 years ago, something seems to have happened in the record here, where we're getting our extremes going well out of anything that we have been experiencing for a whole century. Like, not just a little bit out, and not just one occurrence, but multiple occurrences, such that there you see in June 2012, we had 228 millimeters of precipitation in that month, which was quite a bit times the average that was happening before that, two or three or four times. But if we then, okay, well, something happened once, okay. But then if we then go to the next year, 2013, and this is the year that the Calgary floods had happened and the Canmore issues that happened there, well, we also had our part of that. And you see here that same kind of band of stationarity, and then in recent years we've got this event that just went way outside of anything that had happened before. And you see on June 19th, 2013, we had 98.4 millimeters in a day. And until then, the maximum that we'd ever had in a day was somewhere in the early 1990s, which was maybe 55. And I should have mentioned the slide before that June was associated with a very lethal event, the Johnson's Landing landslide, that killed a number of people. So this was just the next year. And now if we move on to talk about temperature for a moment, this is the historic distribution of temperature in the Caslow Climate Station. And you can see that it's roughly bell-curved distribution around 15, the mean of 14.9, pardon me, and that's from the 20th century. And if we look at the temperature, the mean June temperature in 2015, just a couple of years late after the last extreme event, it was 20.3, far outside of the envelope that extremes have been even occurring in. And that's just like almost year after year at this long-term climate station. Oh, maybe just Caslow's got some bad luck. Well, we can also go across the basin to Radium, the gate of Kootenay National Park, and look at that same 2013 event, and we see the same thing in the last few years. We see events. These are one-day precipitation totals, just going outside anything we had before. This is valuable stuff to have these kinds of records to ground the theory of, because it's not theory, these are solid models of climate change and what's happening. And I guess I put these anecdotes up essentially for excuse me, two reasons. One is to emphasize that the change has already started. It's not something that's in the future. It's already started. Remember the dots for the 21st century. We're already well on the way to the first dot. And So that's the one thing. And then the other thing is to send home my message. My ultimate message is that we need to study where we're living more, and we need to be very systematic about it because we have very limited resources to throw at a lot of variability and a lot of change. So we have to put our thinking caps on and really think hard about what would be the best place for our effort spent. And as I mentioned at the outset, a lot of people contributed to pulling together this synthesis of information. You can read the names. I'm sure you probably know a number. In fact, some people are in this room. But I would like to do a particular shout out to Greg Utzig, who I worked closely with, and he led on the climate aspects from the hydrologic regions and including the climate change projections. He was played an important role in this work. Thank you very much. There's usually, I find, such a wealth of knowledge in the room, so if you have any comments to share with everyone, please do. And if there's any questions that I might be able to answer, I could try to answer them too. So comments or brief comments or questions, depending on the time. Ali, is it? Yeah.
My question is about the community water monitoring. And see how it's not necessarily evenly distributed, but kind of makes sense, like you're saying, it goes with the interest of the community. Do you have a suggestion in terms of, to me it's valuable to keep those stations going that are already established so that you have that longer term data, rather than like, oh, well, let's make it more evenly distributed and space them out around the basin more. Like maybe we could add some more, but it seems good to keep the work valuable by keeping those stations going. Do you have any comment in terms of where you see community-based water monitoring changing?
Well, I just want to remind you, I'm not CBT, right? Just so you know, I'm just presenting the results of a study. Yeah, just wanted to make sure that was clear. But as far as, that's always an interesting question. If you come along one day and you've got 5 to 10 years of a record on a station that shouldn't really have been located in this location and it would have been better over here, what do? Do you say, well, let's invest in something that is in the wrong location? Or do we cut our losses and start over here and then look for ways to, there are ways to extend records based on an adjacent record. You can overlap for a while. There, hydrologically, there are ways to do this. But it's a very tricky question, what you're asking. And I think you'd have to roll up your sleeves, in my mind, and really ask some hard questions about the stations as a whole in the network sense, and what questions are they answering? Like, what questions do you want to answer? Yeah, the wealth of information in the room coming forth here.
I just wanted to piggyback on that because that's part of what we'll be discussing this afternoon in terms of how to. But have you ever thought of doing a map of an overlay of existing community-based monitoring groups and where the gaps are?
Well,
like that,
I have done a gap analysis by hydrologic region, and I haven't extended it to that level, but it wouldn't take too much more work to do that with this information.
Interesting to see
you could do that, yeah.
A sense of what we're monitoring as community groups and where the gaps are in a map. An overlay.
Yeah, my own view is that it is a good idea to think carefully about on a regional basis, where should our stations be, and that might mean letting go of some and holding on to others, but really doing it from a larger network perspective. But that's just my own view. Yeah.
So who would determine that?
Oh, that people who fund these things determine that. Yeah. True enough, but some do, right? There's a mix out there. I mean, some of the big agency work gets affected by political winds that may take out a certain station for a non-scientific reason. But I guess I believe that a lot of it is at that level is driven by science. And I imagine like CBT is involved in a discussion about water quantity and water quality monitoring, and I believe it's scientific, science-based. So. There was two others. Question here, and then you. Okay.
Yes, I'm a meteorologist, so I understand that, and your review is quite comprehensive and I think quite accurate. But my point in relation somewhat to the networks is that we now see, in general, terms, and at one scale that there's going to be changes in temperatures and precipitation. But in our area, we can see the Columbia Lake area, which incidentally is 900, the watershed is 900 square kilometers, and there isn't any monitoring in it at all. But we're just going through an official community plan, and it's difficult. Well, the technology exists to simulate the flow through these watersheds, and somehow that has to be done. It's got to be transferred to the planners, the people who are preparing the plans. We've got to be able to start looking, instead of looking at the broader scale, we've got to be starting looking at the local scale, seeing how these changes are going to affect well, planning in general, what's going to do with the local economy, what's the societal impacts. If we're going to put industry in there, how does it change? What industry can it accommodate, and so on and so forth. So basically, that's a comment, not a question.
Yeah, you're saying it needs to be translated into the communities and activities.
Monitoring to do that. We can't go in our particular case with no monitoring at all. You've got to, it really depends on having something there so you can calibrate these models in the first place.
Okay, well, thank you. Yeah. And what's your name again?
Stella.
Stella, thank you. Yeah.
Back to identifying priorities and filling gaps and collaboration, all of your points at the end of your talk. Has there been consideration given to overlapping where you might identify gaps from the broader climate change perspective and getting, as you say, the basics, and the uses, not only current stresses produced by human uses in the landscape, but future? Because I'm an aquatic biologist, but I'm also a risk assessor and cumulative impact.
Okay, great.
And I have been involved, as many of us have here, in cumulative effects assessments for parts of this region. And where I'm noticing is there is often a complete disconnect between where Environment Canada has decided to put in a station and where your stressors are. So in order to know, for example, if we have even more metallurgical coal mines are proposed for the Upper, superimpose climate change on that, can we please have data sets for the stressors from that human use and from climate change that actually complement each other? So it's another map overlay question, really. So that you can, because with the limited resources we have and time, we need to really optimize where we're collecting the data. That's my little pulpit, little lecture here, but that's where I'm coming from. It's crazy to not be able to connect those dots. And I think this comes back to the gentleman's comment too, where if local planning and decision making needs to know, is that subdivision wise, given what we know about the groundwater resource, the current stress on that, and the superimposed climate change?
Well, thanks, Stella. I work in the same field, more or less, and I have the same experience. And it's actually very hard to get big institutions to look ahead decades. You're asking them to look ahead decades, really, and then start something today. That maybe we did that in the 50s, but we don't really do that so much now, and it's very hard to inspire that. And that's partly why I put those anecdotes on at the end, is because those anecdotes are starting to pile up, and those are it's almost like shock treatment for, yeah, we do need to act.
Well, let's face it, a lot of water quality stations set up by the federal government just because it was a highway crossing there.
Right. Anne, and then yourself, okay? But Anne, you had a question? Oh, you didn't have a question? Sorry. What's your name?
Susan.
Susan, thanks.
Yeah, I'm new to the whole water quality monitoring game, but so I really appreciated your report, Martin. I thought it was comprehensive and concise and understandable, which is really important for lay people like me. Yeah, so thank you for that. And thanks to Columbia Basin Trust for commissioning it, because yeah, that's where it all started. I have a two-part question, and it has to do with ground and surface water. I think the BC government is in the process of doing an inventory of wells in the province. Is that?
It's been underway for a long time. I mean, they've done a tremendous amount of background work for a good part of a decade.
Okay,
yeah.
So is there information on that?
Yeah, well, there's an observation well network.
No, I'm talking about, like, I've got a well on my property,
Potable water well.
and I'm supposed to be registering it, I think.
Oh, the specific. Actually, Richard, sorry to put you on the spot, but she's asking about information on wells that are in the database, in provincial database. Do you know if they're actually putting, you're meaning an individual homeowner's well? Is that what?
That's what I understand.
I
Just want some
I think
clarification, because it seems to me that if we're looking at our water resources, a lot of people in the Kootenays get their water from wells.
There's a procedure. I don't know that it's voluntary or whether there's a time limit or something like that. But
I don't
maybe
need the specifics.
yeah.
I just want to know, is that a piece of the whole study of basin water resources?
You're right, and it was part of the Water Sustainability Act, and they were giving you an optional 3-year period, which I think we're either on year 2 or 3, to register your well without a cost.
That's right.
And
Yeah.
they were like grandfathered in or something as well, and then after that certain period, in a year, 6 months.
I guess what asking is all of this data going to be available at some point so that it can be factored into reports like this?
Anyway,
I don't know what their plans are as far as improving their database, but the database is very deficient. And because it was basically a voluntary submission by the drillers. I know a lot of wells have never been submitted to the. The other problem with it is the data is being gathered from the drillers, and the drillers are mechanics, they're not geologists. And so the descriptions of the stuff that they're drilling through is very subjective, and you have to take a look at a blue clay and say, is that glacial drift or is it a lake water? So there are real gaps in the data, but there's still a lot of work that can be done with the data.
There's decades and decades of cleaning up no database, so they have a lot of work to do. Maggie, did you have a comment on this?
I was just going to say exactly what Richard said, that I know my experience in the province is that it is drillers that put in the data, so it's inconsistent data, and also they were not going to make that data available to any general public, to anyone. It's being collected for the provincial government because it's some of the data is classified under freedom of information protection. So that's just the experience that I have, and maybe that will be different.
There's a big database out there that's freely available to everybody. You can find it on IMAP.
Yeah.
And it has locations of
It's got
personal
all the
people.
locations, and it's got all kinds of who the owners are.
Oh, okay. That's way more information.
I guess I'd just like a little compliment to the province on this, because they've got decades and decades to correct for, and it's going to take time. I mean, there's no way we can have a state-of-the-art system, not for a long, long time. We were the last jurisdiction in North America to license groundwater, so it's going to take time, and I think we're slowly getting there now.
Quickly then, my other question was, is the province measuring actual use by water licensees?
No, only major users. Yeah, major point users get measured, but the rest is not actually measured.
There are 40-some water licenses on the creek that I help monitor, and I've been delving into the flow statistics, which go back to 1913, because there is a Water Survey of Canada continuous logger on the creek, and it just seems to me that if what is or forecasting, forecasting, and it seems to be happening as we speak, is the case, then those 40-some water licensees are gonna.
Well,
I can't rely on that supply.
And again, I'm going to be fair to the province here. You can't go from absolutely nothing, like no metering, to full metering. It's not going to happen. We're a pretty hands-off population. We don't really want a lot of government, a lot of people. So the Water Sustainability Act has reorganized governance, and it's a good start. It's certainly not perfect, but it's a start. And there is the potential for metering to happen in conflict situations in the future. So step by step. Yeah.
But isn't it in water users' own interests?
It might be, yeah.
Measuring to be taking place, because
Yeah.
if it's a finite limited resource, well,
Might depend on
resource, then we need to share it equitably.
Might depend on which water user you are, though. You might be the one who doesn't get to use the water anymore. A couple more questions, Richard?
I just want to make a comment on that. The new Water Sustainability Act encourages a collaboration with individual groups, maybe not individual owners, to monitor and look after the water supply. They've asked for this several times in one of our previous conferences, and they want to work with the individual groups. I'm trying to put together one right now to work with them, so that so the responsibility is local against that.
Other questions?
I have
What's your
one
name?
more question. I've worked in other provinces, and I'm having a little trouble in understanding how the government works.
That's a different concept.
We've come to these meetings, and there never seems to be anybody from the government here who can conduct dialogue with them. Some of the questions are rather basic. Is there such a thing as a hydrologist, for instance, in Kerry, or is all the decisions made in Victoria?
Perhaps we should chat over coffee about that. But there are regional staff. There's regional operations and there's regional staff, and they may or may not have the kind of staff person that you're speaking about. Depends on the region and the history, because there's pretty steady cutbacks. We're having our regional hydrologist with Flinro retiring next month over in Nelson. So the sort of answer is yes and no, and it's a bit of a hodgepodge. Yeah, but let's chat over coffee over that.
There's another problem too, because water resources is split between the Ministry of the Environment and the NLNR.
Flinro, yeah. Ministry of Everything. It's split between more than that. That's a big split, but there are other ministries that are involved in water, yeah. Any other questions, including people who might not have had a chance? No? Should we close now then?
Sure.
Yeah, I just personally want to thank Marty for that warm welcome this morning to your territory, and Bonnie for hosting us on Chinaka territory. I feel honored to be able to give this presentation here. Thank you very much. Okay. Copy the report if you want to see it.